Welcome to Friend or Foe, the series where we pick apart the characters from some of our favorite games to figure out who is a friend, someone we don't need to worry will stab us in the back, and who is a foe, someone who would intentionally bring harm to the group if given the chance. I'm Josh Bearheart Hawk, and today we're trying to figure out just what makes Nick from Telltale Games' The Walking Dead Season 2 tick. As always, you can find a link in the description to a playlist for this series for those long nights where you just want to sit back, relax, and listen to a bunch of breakdowns all at once. The first time we meet Nick in Telltale's The Walking Dead Season 2, he has a gun pointed haphazardly at a little girl that his best friend Luke and Uncle Pete brought out of the woods. The girl's name is Clementine, and no matter what she does, Nick will wind up pulling the trigger of his gun while aiming it in her direction, though he thankfully misses her by inches with the round. Prior to the start of the zombie outbreak, Nick had his Uncle Pete, his mom, and his best friend Luke to call family. He looked up to Luke and Pete both, but especially to Luke, who seemed to always have such an easy way of handling things, even when they went wrong. Nick and Luke had a business together for a short while, though it didn't go very well and they wound up flat broke after only a few months. That didn't really seem to matter as the pair were having fun, and had it not been for the end of the world, there's no telling where they would have wound up in the long run. But the world did come to a crashing halt, and Nick found himself struggling to survive alongside his family. At some point after the fall of society, the small group found themselves joining another group of people at a house hardware store, and they'd wind up staying there for a while under the leadership of a man named William Carver. But Luke and Carver didn't get along very well, and before long, Nick joined his mom, Luke, and Uncle Pete alongside a man named Alvin, Alvin's wife Rebecca, a doctor named Carlos, and his daughter Sarah, as they all split off and left the house hardware. They would eventually find a cabin deep in the woods to call home, at least temporarily, and though they were worried that Carver may come after them, the place seemed safe enough. At some point after settling into the cabin, the group was joined by someone who turned out to be the victim of a zombie bite, and that person would wind up turning unexpectedly and biting Nick's mom. At that point, as if things couldn't get any worse, Nick had to be the one to end his mother's life. And that brings us back around to where we first meet him in the games, as he's standing over Clementine with a rifle. He's been through a ton of trauma, doing things that no one should ever have to do. But that trauma doesn't excuse poor muzzle awareness, and we're not off to a good start when trying to figure out whether we can trust him. For those who maybe have never handled a firearm or haven't gotten any kind of formal training, the number one rule of handling a gun in any kind of situation is to never point it at anything you don't intend to shoot. It doesn't matter if it is loaded or not, or if the safety is on or not. You never point the muzzle at a person or living creature unless you want it dead. Nick should know this, as we find out later on that his Uncle Pete taught him about guns and even took him hunting. But he failed miserably and honestly shouldn't even be allowed to have a weapon after this, as he's liable to shoot someone or something that he shouldn't. Moving past that, Nick is firmly against helping Clementine in any way, and argues in favor of shooting her even after he missed, as she's been bitten by something and he'd rather be safe than sorry after what happened with his mother. This stance makes at least some sense in context, but given how small the girl is and the fact that they now know what to look for in someone who's about to turn, it seems rather harsh to take such a hardline angle when she's clearly in need of help. They could handle her if she did wind up turning, and they should be able to take precautions to prevent any harm coming to anyone in the group. In Nick's defense here, he does wind up later realizing he was wrong and apologizes after Clementine breaks out of the shed, bandages herself up, and is brought inside. If nothing else, he should use this moment as a lesson to improve how he handles things in the future. But that kind of self-awareness and ability to change is rare in people in general, and while Nick seems to be aware of his anger issues, he doesn't know how to control them or self-regulate. He winds up going with his Uncle Pete and Clementine the following morning as they're supposed to be checking the fish traps down at the river. But things go sideways when they stumble on several dead bodies and get overrun by zombies. If you choose to go with Nick, as I did on my Lost in Games live stream of this episode per viewer request, you'll get the chance to talk to him a bit and learn about how he had to put his mother down, while also seeing just how deep his depression goes. That moment is especially hard for him, as Uncle Pete died just moments before, and he's more or less given up on life as the world seems to be falling apart around him. We don't know how long ago he lost his mother, but to lose her and then Pete, who was like a father to him, in a short span of time is more than most people would be able to handle in the modern zombie-free world. Going through those losses in a world that's fallen so far and seems to have nothing but death around every corner would be crushing to say the least. It's worth mentioning that if you choose to go with Pete instead, he'll ask you to look out for Nick, and when you tell Nick that Pete wanted to see him just before he died, he'll go quiet and fall behind the group. No matter which way you choose to take things, Clementine and the rest of the group wind up having to flee the cabin that they were staying in, as Carver does show up, and they eventually wind up at the foot of a mountain, with a plan to head up and stay the night in a ski lodge at the top. Before they can get there, however, they have to cross a bridge, and while Nick wants to help Luke clear the structure, Luke refuses to let him go along, taking Clementine instead and setting up a series of events that leads to several deaths in the long run. Luke and Clementine meet a man named Matthew on the bridge after clearing some zombies off it, and though Matthew seems friendly enough, he isn't long for the world as Nick shows up, points his rifle at the man, and shoots him. He says he thought Matthew was a danger to Clem and Luke, but it's really hard to justify that as Matthew wasn't pointing his weapon at anyone until Nick showed up with his. The whole situation is a mess, and it's made worse when they finally reach the ski lodge to find out that Matthew had a partner, Walt, who's waiting on his return. Now, to be completely fair, in a situation like the zombie apocalypse, it can be beneficial at times to shoot first and ask questions later. You never really know who you're interacting with, and being the first to pull the trigger could wind up being the difference between being put in the ground and getting home safely. That being said, if Nick had only taken the time to ask questions and not point his rifle in the direction of Clementine, Luke, and Matthew, no one would have been killed. Going back to muzzle awareness, there was an incredibly high risk of hitting either Clementine or Luke by pointing the rifle in their direction. He also didn't take the time to think about the fact that if the man he saw with his friends was actually planning to kill them right where they stood, they probably would have been dead already. Meaning pointing his gun and firing at all was the worst thing he could have done in the moment because the risk was actually very low. And that actually brings us to the first possible death for Nick, as Walt finds out that he was the one responsible for Matthew's death. See, Walt had given Matthew a knife at the start of the outbreak, and Matthew carried it with him wherever he went. After he's killed, the group checks the shed that he'd been staying in for food, and Clementine winds up keeping the knife after finding it in a chest. Later on, Walt spots it in her backpack as he's heading outside after dinner. Realizing that Matthew wouldn't have willingly given up the knife, Walt figures out he's likely dead and assumes this new group that's shown up was likely involved as he'd overheard one of them saying they'd shot someone. The idea that that someone was Matthew might be a big leap, or it might make a lot of sense depending on when the two had last seen each other. Either way, Walt fingers Nick as the likely killer, and Clementine confirms it as Nick comes outside and asks for Walt's forgiveness. Well, he asks for forgiveness depending on how Clementine approaches the situation, and that leads to Walt either shooting a zombie that's attacking Nick or letting Nick get eaten a few moments later. But no matter what happens in that moment, Nick doesn't really play much of a role in the rest of the season. Even if he lives, he doesn't talk much after that other than a brief conversation you can have with him back at Hal's Hardware, where he says he believes Luke will be coming to save them. He'll also agree with Luke about staying put when the debate about what to do after Kenny is beaten comes up. But even in that very best situation, he winds up dead and tangled in a fence where Clementine and Jane find him and end his suffering. And that brings us to the discussion about whether to classify Nick as a friend or a foe. We've had several characters in this series that could be compared to Nick in one way or another, and he's even been called the Ben of Season 2 in the community at large. This is mainly because he seems to be more or less kind of just there most of the time, not taking any initiative to do much to help the group overall, and making mistakes that cost lives. Those mistakes and his general lack of self-awareness make him a liability to any group that he's in, and mean that resources would need to be dedicated to making up for his shortcomings, potentially making him a bigger drain on the group than a help. On the other hand, he's not ill-intentioned, and he wants to do the right thing even when he doesn't know how. He's also been through a lot and has some major self-esteem issues that could be addressed with a little encouragement and the right motivation. For one thing, he's constantly comparing himself to Luke, and the rest of the group is doing the same even when it doesn't really make sense. He knows deep down that Luke makes a lot of mistakes as well, but he lacks the confidence of his childhood friend and badly wants to be like him. Realistically, the best thing for Nick would probably be to get away from Luke and to find a mentor figure who actually understands him. Pete could have been that figure, though he saw himself more as a role model than a mentor, and never really understood Nick on a personal level. If Pete had spent more time teaching Nick and less time making fun of him for his inability to shoot deer, things might have turned out differently for him. With that being said, Nick falls into the friend category with some caveats. For one thing, in order to be a better asset to the group, he needs some help with his confidence, and he needs someone who is willing to be patient with him in the process of growing that. He's been through hell, and he isn't equipped mentally to handle some of the things that he's seen and had to do. Everyone handles stress, pressure, and trauma differently. And even in the zombie apocalypse, it's important to realize that and work with those who just need a little extra push. And that's the other side of this, because the group in general was really bad. And even Pete and Luke didn't seem to be as understanding as they should have been with him. For one thing, they should not have allowed him to have a gun in the chaos that followed Clementine's arrival, as he clearly lacked the awareness to handle it. Pete or someone else should have been holding the rifle, and they all should have been paying attention to where it was being pointed. In the situation with the bridge, Luke should have taken both Nick and Clementine along to help to make sure that the place was safe. He wanted to help, and he was trying to find a way to redeem himself and stand up after Pete's death, and it would have made more sense to have him along than to leave him behind. They also should have been honest from the jump about Matthew, explaining the situation to the people they met at the ski lodge and acknowledging their mistakes in the whole thing. Matthew's death is on Nick for sure, but the rest of the group made decisions that led to what happened, and they can't get any better in the long run if they aren't willing to admit that. But now it's time for you to chime in below and let me know in the comments if you agree with my assessment. Do you think that Nick is a friend, even as flawed as he may be, or did I miss something that should have landed him in the foe category? I also want to point out here that I do read the comments, and I do make note of the reactions people have to these friend or foe videos, And there's been a lot of comments on some of the more controversial characters that I've covered lately by people who clearly didn't pay attention to the nuance being used in my breakdowns. This series is about using critical thinking, empathy, psychology, and a touch of philosophy to really dig into characters to understand their motivations and actions. That means leaving our biases and preconceived ideas about them at the door and paying attention to the details, even when we don't like the conclusions those details lead to. For each and every one of these breakdowns, I start by going through the story of the character and try to look at the world through their eyes. I don't decide ahead of time what they will be or wind up being. I follow the story and let it lead me to the conclusion. That's why some of the characters wind up falling into categories that you might not expect based on the popular opinion of them. I urge you, as always, to strive to form your own opinions and follow the facts about characters to whatever conclusion they lead to. You might be surprised how much better things can be in the world when we choose to treat others as they deserve to be treated instead of how we are told to treat them. With that out of the way, if you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit the like button below and subscribe to Lost in Games on YouTube so you don't miss any future Friend or Foe episodes, as I've got some amazing characters to cover this year. Also, make sure you don't miss the other main series on the channel, Philosophy and Ethics in Games, where I break down the stories in games and use them as thought experiments to explore the world that we live in from an ethical and historical perspective. If you want to help the channel out in other ways, I've got channel memberships here on YouTube, a Patreon, and a membership program on my website where you can sign up and check out some extra content that you won't find anywhere else. Joining any of those gets your name on the screen in videos and helps me keep making these awesome deep dives into the future. That's all I've got for this one. I want to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.